Welcome back. The mayor of Chicago is blaming white folks for black on white crime. Really? Really, motherfucker? You want to go that route? Wow. In this video, recent outfalls in Chicago have reported offenders 72% time doing the crime as black. The one black offender that did the crime did 72 crimes and still have not faced consequences for it. And the mayor had the fucking stones to try to say it's white people's fault.
We cannot incarcerate our way out of violence.
Right here, in this video, a repeat offender with 72% further arrests set a 26-year-old woman on fire on a Chicago train. And Chicago Mayor Brian Johnson is trying to use crime to fill his massive budget deficit rather than address the issues and say he's a fucking joke.
We've ended up with the largest prison population in the world without solving the problems of crime and violence. The addiction on jails and incarceration in this country, we have moved past that. It is racist, it is immoral, it is unholy, and it is not the way to drive violence down.
So that right there is Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson giving an impassioned speech about how mass incarceration definitely 100% doesn't reduce violent crime, and in reality, in actuality, we've tried it, it's absolutely failed, and in addition to that, it's evil, white, and racist in order to do so. Now, of course, Brandon Johnson is on the defensive in terms of his woke criminal justice policies after a man who was released 72 times, that was his criminal record, prior to the action that we're talking about, set a 26-year-old woman on fire on the train. So of course, because that was a black man, a repeat offender, who attacked this woman for no reason, and Brandon Johnson doesn't want to face the reality, the topic is about how mass incarceration and locking people up 100% would not have prevented this, and it's racist for you to think it would because the black man is the one who committed the crime, therefore it has to be a story about evil white racism. Now, of course, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, this is something that we 100% are going to take down and dismantle throughout the course of this video, but before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
So I have an entire video on this channel about how mass incarceration 100% worked in reducing crime in the United States of America. In fact, you can look at charts of prison population to violent crime in this nation, and what you ultimately end up discovering is that yes, when you had prison populations lowering, you had a massive crime increase. When that started to invert, guess what? Crime ended up falling in response to that, and this is because incarceration has a very simple and basic philosophy behind it. And no, it's not deterrence, no, it's not rehabilitation, it is incapacitation. When you remove people who are repeat offenders from society and you put them in prison, guess what? Because they're in prison, they're not out in society repeat offending. It is called a mechanical way to lower the crime rate in this nation, and absolutely 100% it definitely worked. And again, all you need to do is look at what happened when prison population was declining, when we embraced the medicalization of criminality and how it wasn't really the fault of the criminal, it must have been the fault of society, because that led to the greatest crime increase in the history of the country. The Great Society welfare programs that were meant to address the root causes of crime led to the greatest crime increase, the greatest crime wave that was decades long in the history of the country, and it wasn't changed until the mid-90s when the tough on crime movement really gained steam. Again, these are objective facts, these are realities, this is something that you cannot ignore, you cannot deny. And this is why every single argument the left has against incarcerating repeat offenders is always something that is not what we're talking about. Like they'll say, oh, well, recidivism is high in the United States of America, therefore the people that you're sending to prison aren't getting rehabilitated, therefore it didn't work. Well, again, it's about incapacitation, not recidivism. Then they'll talk about how deterrence isn't really effective. People don't see and fear the consequences that other people face, therefore you're not deterring crime, so I guess it didn't work. And again, I will respond to that. It's not about deterrence. That would be a secondary benefit. It's about incapacitation. Always has been, always will be. Or like my favorite statistical trick, when people on the left will tell you, well, after around the 2000s, an increase in prison population resulted in less gains in terms of crime reduction in the outside. Therefore, all of the time period when the prison population was increased prior to that, and it was effective, is meaningless because it stopped being effective after a certain point. Now, of course, this is the concept of marginal utility. Just because something's good and something works doesn't mean if you keep adding onto it that it's going to work at the same rate forever. And by the way, you understand this intuitively. Let me give you an example so you can understand it a little bit better. If I told you a gallon of water can save somebody's life, that is a true statement. We all understand that if you don't have access to fresh drinking water, if you don't have access to fresh water at all whatsoever, and you are given a gallon of water, you will be able to drink it. You will be able to survive. And yes, water is something that we need in order to survive. However, in modern Western countries where we have free access to drinking water, so much so that we bathe in it, so much so that we do our laundry, some of us have pools in this country, obviously a gallon of fresh water to that person is not going to make the difference between life or death. Now, that doesn't mean water doesn't save lives. What it means is that at a certain point, when you've accumulated enough water, every gallon isn't as valuable as it would have been in that situation in comparison where you actually needed the 1 gallon to drink the water. This is marginal utility. Yes, something can work up to a certain point, and then at a certain point, the returns are not going to be as good. We all understand it. It does not debunk the prison population increases and the resulting decrease in crime on the outside, nor the value of incapacitation. And of course, there's an extreme example of this, which is El Salvador. They dramatically increased their prison population. They started targeting gangs. They built the super prison. And of course, El Salvador went from a place that 10 years ago was the most dangerous place on planet Earth, where 1 in every 10,000 El Salvadorians were murdered in a single year, to the safest place in the Western Hemisphere because they locked up their gangs, their repeat offenders, because guess what? Mass incarceration obviously does in fact work. Now, that's not to say that there's no trade-offs, that there's no cost or any of that, but the thing is, those are rational counterpoints to whether or not this is the best strategy, but the left does not argue on a rational basis. They make the case that it's racist. Again, white girl gets burned by a guy who was released 72 times. He was released recently over the objections of the prosecutor because the judge said, I want to give him an ankle monitor because he's an innocent Baba Angel Aladdin, definitely on the cusp of reforming tomorrow. And he set a woman on fire, laughed about it when he was arrested, basically ruined this poor girl's life. And we're supposed to pretend that locking him up after 50 arrests wouldn't have spared all those additional victims.
This is an absolute failure of our criminal justice as well as our mental health institutions.
Speaking one day after federal authorities charged Lawrence Reed with a terroristic attack on mass transit, Mayor Brandon Johnson said they are eyeing changes to address housing and mental health.
Brandon Johnson is genuinely one of the worst people in American politics. Just a day after charges were dropped on this man who was released 72 times, again, recently over the objection of the Cook County Prosecutor's Office because a judge decided that he needed another chance and ankle monitoring was no big deal at all whatsoever. Brandon Johnson is talking about how we need more money from the state government in order to fund mental health and homeless services. Make no mistake about it, this suspect was already diverted multiple times to mental health care. He was already given multiple different chances. And by the way, crime is actually trending down in certain categories in the city of Chicago, and that is due in large part that we've had a transition from the previous state's attorney, Kimberly Fox, who notably let Jussie Smollett off the hook and totally tanked that case. That's why Jussie was able to win in an appeal, to somebody who's actually prosecuting people. So we know for a fact that even in Chicago, their gains in terms of a reduction in crime are due to the fact that their state's attorney changed and the philosophy changed. But Brandon Johnson is still talking about, mental health and homelessness.
How will you specifically, that when we ask for specifics, he stopped short sort of committing to more visible police on the CTA and fewer unhoused users writing for short-term shelter.
I think it's too early to speculate like what that absolutely looks like. But again, the funding from Springfield is the most important thing. Without that funding, then none of this will be visibilized.
Again, leave it to a progressive to do a press conference about how we need to address mental health and homeless services and whatnot without actually making any commitments to any policies that will actually solve the problem, like more law enforcement on their public transit system. Like, what are you actually going to do to prevent homeless people from getting on these trains and using them as temporary shelters? How are you actually going to address the issues you're bringing up yourself? Brandon Johnson has no answer specifically to any of that. Instead, he wants to complain about money because what Brandon Johnson is actually looking to do is fill his budget deficit. And I would just point out for those of you out there in the audience that Brandon Johnson is lying to residents of the city of Chicago right now in this moment, claiming that he needs all these additional taxes in order to pay for public safety. However, when pressed by the local news during an interview, we found out that Brandon Johnson is trying to classify youth employment programs as public safety instead of law enforcement. So the guy is going to reduce spending on police, that's in his budget, in order to redirect it to his core constituents in order to try to win black people back over in the city of Chicago.
I can't live in hypothetical. What I can say is that we're talking about a community a safety fund that will strictly go to ensuring that the mental health and well-being of our police officers is secure.
Well, the majority of that is going for the summer youth jobs, half of it.
Hiring people is a part of our safety plan. In fact, this is why this budget is so critical, right? Because this budget protects us from Trump's cuts.
So yeah, the guy's a liar through and through. And by the way, I'm 100% sick of hearing about mental health after a situation like this. The time to address this guy's mental health issues, if those are legitimate, was well before this instance. It was in any of these 72 opportunities that preceded this. You have shown us that you have no capacity to do so, and I will point out that he has a long, violent history of crimes. And yes, the standard for forcing somebody into some kind of mandatory care should be a danger to yourself and others, and this guy has proven that he is multiple times, and yet they've done nothing, and we're still talking about mental health after he nearly killed a woman, after he burned this woman's face for his own entertainment. That's what we're discussing.
Lawrence Reed has a long criminal history, including about 50 arrests over the past 3 decades. We showed you this summer how the CTA bans passengers from their property, circulating a bulletin with their photo and details, information that is shared with CTA employees, contracted security firms, and Chicago police. But CTA employees tell us they never took such actions against Reed, who did previously plead guilty in January 2020 to breaking the windows on an O'Hare Blue Line train and was sentenced to 2 years probation for that crime. Reed was also the suspect in an active aggravated battery case from August, accused of hitting a social worker at McNeil Psychiatric Hospital. A judge ordered him onto electronic monitoring, though her handwritten notes don't show why she made that decision.
So that August crime right there could have been the point where they put a stop to this. They tried the woke nonsense. They tried the non-law enforcement interventions. They put him in a psychiatric hospital, voluntarily, of course. He wasn't forced to be in there, and they had him meet with a social worker in order to talk out his issues. But what did he do in that scenario? He punched that woman in the face. He ended up chipping her tooth. I believe he caused her a concussion, damaged her optic nerve in her eye because he punched her square in the eye, and yet a judge looked at that and decided, you know what? No big deal. Innocent Beba Angel Aladdin, he was already in a mental health hospital, but I'm not gonna actually remand him to the custody of that hospital or to the custody of the Cook County Jail. He's gonna give him more freedoms, which was an ankle monitor that allows him to be out for 40 hours a week. Presumably she thought he was